thanks for everyone for being here today. What we thought we'd do is just start off and dive right in to the project at hand, and we have several panel discussions to build on that throughout the day, with hopefully what will include plenty of time for questions and answers, both about the project and from larger, broader policy issues moving forward. Our goal for today is to really hear from not only the panelists and the participants in this pilot project, but also from all of the attendees. I think we'd really like to come away today with a better understanding of what's possible through real-world evidence, and hopefully this pilot project will begin to demonstrate that through the efforts of our various partners. But also think about the future and what needs to happen next. This was intended to be a pilot project, which oftentimes is hypothesis generating rather than overly conclusive, but I think we'll see some interesting data. So, everybody who does a PowerPoint presentation seems to not be able to move the slides forward. There we go. Maybe it was a surprise that I'm up here to give this presentation. But anyway, to dive right in, this just gives an overview of what we were hoping to accomplish. And I want to note how rapid this project came together. So it was very much toward the end of last year when we began thinking about what could we contribute to the field by bringing different diverse data partners together to try and level set and assess where the field of real-world evidence was in oncology and begin to think about where it needs to go in sort of a pre-competitive partnership. And I hope that's what we've been able to pull together here. So what we wanted to do was develop a project that was looking at the potential utilization of real-world evidence, potential endpoints that might merit further consideration and further study, and do so in a way that was independent of any particular drug, any particular data partner, or any particular approach, to really look at a variety of different approaches to see how similar different participants would answer the same question. So in this case, we looked at what different outcomes can be evaluated for advanced non-small cell lung cancer patients that are treated with an immune checkpoint inhibitor. And the main reasons that we chose this as sort of the case study to explore were a couple relatively simple ones. The first being that there are multiple approved drugs for this indication, and again, we didn't want this to be about any one drug and its potential outcome. The purpose of this pilot is not to re-adjudicate what has already been seen in clinical trials and what's being observed through the broader use of those products. So we won't be separating by the different drugs that are included in the pilot. We also didn't necessarily want this to be about any one potential capability of any of the data partners. They all do wonderful work and have great strengths associated with their use. The sources of data both have their opportunities and limitations associated with it, but we wanted to focus on how each would answer the same question. So we won't be identifying outwardly each of the data sources. As I'm sure you've noticed in the papers that were distributed in advance of the meeting, each of the different data participants has been just assigned a random letter so that we're focused more on the endpoints that are evaluated here as opposed to who produced them from their data. But hopefully through the course of discussion we'll be able to better understand what some of the challenges and opportunities are. I think the other area that was of interest was looking at just some long-term questions in the immune checkpoint field about what are the long-term benefits of these products that may not be realized in the context of a clinical trial, but may require different sources of information in order to demonstrate that. So I also want to recognize the data partners that are listed at the bottom here. This was a huge undertaking under a very rapid time frame. When we first started discussing this, we noted this morning that one of our very first project proposals around this was around mid-December. So we quickly pulled a group together that you'll hear from in a few minutes, representative of each of these data partners who have worked very quickly to pull these analyses together over the course of a couple of short months. And I think it's great to see the willingness to work together on this and share data, but also I think that you'll find the results quite interesting. So this information is included in the white papers that were distributed in your folders and should be accessible online today. But these are basically the definitions that the data partners helped define in terms of the endpoints that we were interested in looking at. And I won't go through these, you can read them in your paper, but I think it's interesting to note that while these definitions are quite straightforward and have gotten a lot of support from external folks that we've discussed the project with, it certainly may not recognize the complexity of what goes into actually extracting this type of information and how to do it in a uniform way across different data sets in order to allow the accurate comparisons that we've tried to put together today. So as a representative, this information again is built on the numbers that were distributed to everyone earlier. We've just put it in a bit more of a visual presentation here so that you have the numbers both ways. But I think what's quite striking, I know these graphs are small, but for each of these different demographic characteristics, age, histology, gender, line of treatment, I think it's what's not only very interesting with this information is that all of this information was so readily extracted from each of the different data partners' sources, no matter the source, no matter the size, no matter whether it was based on claims data or electronic health record data, the similarity between the characterization of the population receiving immune checkpoint inhibitors is quite similar. And I think that that's a very interesting finding in itself, which I think sets up the potential for taking a deeper dive into the future and the utilization of this data in a uniform way moving forward. This information shows some of the conclusions about the endpoints that I mentioned. So overall survival as extracted by each of the data partners according to those definitions that were just listed, time to treatment duration, and time to next treatment being the predominant endpoints that we were interested in looking at. OS, of course, being the gold standard for randomized clinical trials that is typically sought after, but two other endpoints that we were interested that are more readily extracted from electronic health records and from claims data that will be the source of discussion today. And I think that it's quite interesting in looking at these. Not only do we see a relative similarity between the overall survival as extracted by the different data partners, but we actually see a good level of agreement in terms of the magnitude of determining time to treatment discontinuation as well as time to next treatment, which I think merits the further explanation of what these endpoints may be able, what conclusions someday might be able to be drawn using this information. To dive into a little bit deeper into some of the demographic characteristics from that previous finding to look at potential variables that may result in differences within the population, I think these two in particular, with the binary classification of age, in case you're not able to read this, on the two upper graphs, the left-hand red bar is patients of ages 75 years or younger, and the blue bar is 75 years or older. I think what's interesting is while you see some variability across the different data sets here, you actually see pretty good similarity between the patients that are 75 years and younger and 75 years and older, which I think raises questions about what the potential could be in terms of using this type of real-world evidence for future policy, or thinking about things like a better understanding the effect of the Medicare population, for example, if they weren't included in the original clinical trials. And the same with gender, where you see some degree of consistency around between the different response levels according to sex. And I won't go into greater detail here, but I think one of the nice things, while as you start to dive down into the data a little bit more based on some of the characteristics that this information was being able to be extracted from, and you start to see some differences of variability, of course, because the overall populations are getting smaller at this point. But I think what's really remarkable to stay focused on for the sake of this pilot project is the level of detail which was able to be provided from each of the data partners. To be able to pull this information and take a deeper look at different parameters and demographics, particularly for populations that may not have been included in the clinical trials originally, is quite striking in terms of the capability of this type of information. So next, as we look further into some of these endpoints, we wanted to explore how they correlated with overall survival, again, as the gold standard. And without going into a whole lot of detail, I think this will be a source of discussion in the panels to come. But I think it is worth noting that as you look under the correlation between each of these, whether it's time to next treatment or time to treatment discontinuation, there's relative agreement in terms of how well these correlate with the overall survival endpoint. And I think one of the things that we would like to discuss today is how sufficient is this type of information, and how can it support the potential being an indicator of overall survival, and what is the potential application of this type of information in terms of future decision making based on extracting this type of information. And similarly, in the bottom graph shows a couple of endpoints that were able to be extracted from electronic health record data that also has a pretty nice correlation, and actually quite high again in terms of real-world extracted PFS information that's able to be obtained based on the clinical notes in the chart as an indicator of PFS and time to progression. One final sort of note that we wanted to raise for the sake of discussion here. This again is just sort of a recharacterization of the overall survival data that was in that earlier table. But what we put into this graph is the red lines represent the ranges that were observed in the pivotal trials for each of the approved PD-1 inhibitors. So I think what you'll see here is while it doesn't match exactly, and there is some variability between the different data sets, for the most part, each of them cover the same range that was observed in the pivotal trials that were used for the approval of these agents, which indicates that perhaps there isn't the same level of diminishing treatment effect, at least for immune checkpoint inhibitors in lung cancer, that some have speculated may happen once the drug goes into a more diverse population. It's something, again, that I think may be context specific, but is a very interesting outcome of this initial assessment. And again, just speaking to the power of the partners here, to be able to see this replicated 6 different times from 6 different data sets, I think is quite interesting in terms of the consistency which was able to be demonstrated. And finally, again, this is just the recharacterization of the time to treatment discontinuation data. But similarly, we placed in here the red line of what was observed in the information that Dr. Blumenthal will present later on this morning from a project that was a collaboration with the FDA and MGH about looking at how these endpoints are extracted within clinical trial data. So again, this was the time to treatment discontinuation average as seen, or median as seen from the clinical trials used to support the approval of checkpoint inhibitors. And again, you'll see that this is relatively close to the range that was obtained from the analysis based on the real world population. So just a couple of conclusions before we move into our discussion. Number one, there was a high degree of shared characteristics between the different data partners. No matter the source, the sample size, the different populations that were included in their analysis, there's a description of those populations in the white papers that you have today. We were able to see a good level of consistency, but also great feasibility in terms of the depth of information that was able to be extracted. We were able to show through this pilot project that several of the extractable endpoints correlate quite well with overall survival data. We believe that this is a stepping off point, something that will be of interesting discussion. We're very interested in thoughts about what could be done next in order to further this research, to further characterize these endpoints, to look at ways to even further improve the potential consistency in how they're extracted and calculated. And from that, I think we've seen from some of these discussions, those ranges might even be able to tighten up a little bit more. Survival among patients assessed through electronic health records and claims data, they fall within the range of the median OS and time to treatment discontinuation as seen in several of the clinical trials, which I think is a very interesting indicator for, and builds the case even for perhaps looking at ways to increase the diversity of participation in clinical trials while still maintaining the treatment effect that was observed. And finally, an assessment of the extracted endpoints from EHR and claims data demonstrate that the efficacy of the immune checkpoint inhibitors is consistent around a variety of different patient characteristics, including sex and age, but may be variable based on other demographics that were able to be obtained through this pilot project. So again, a couple of key topics, not necessarily that we are expecting the first panel to address, but throughout the day, these are a couple of key topics that we'd really like to add into the discussion based on this preliminary information, and look forward to hearing your thoughts on ways that we can improve the format and quality of real-world evidence, how to develop the data and increase the incentives to be able to do so. Looking at further the role that real-world endpoints can play both in the drug development process, in the regulatory process, but importantly as well as demonstrating long-term value. And I think that's an important component here, that hopefully today we'll be discussing a variety of uses. I know there's been a lot of interest in policy circles around the regulatory uses of real-world evidence, and while that's very important, I think it's important to think also about the different potential uses of real-world evidence and the strength of the evidence that would be required in order to make conclusions for different intended uses of the data, which hopefully will come out in discussion. And like I said, we're very interested also in next steps. So we hope that we'll be able to leave this meeting today thinking about, what could Pilot 2.0 look like in this space. We haven't necessarily communicated that with our data partners, I hope they'll still all join me on the stage now for our first discussion. But for all of you that are representatives of the organizations that helped us out today, we really appreciate it. Like I said, this was a really very rapidly put together project, and we truly want to thank the individuals and the teams really that helped pull this together, from CODA, from Flatiron Health, IQVIA, Kaiser, the Cancer Research Network, the Mayo Clinic Optum Labs collaboration, and the PCORE sites coordinated through the University of Iowa. But really look forward, thank you all for doing what you've done to support this discussion. The next session will be moderated by Dr. Elad Sharon from the NCI, who also is part of the steering committee for this project with many others. And look forward to the discussion moving forward. We won't put you on the spot in terms of the commitment for future projects, but we appreciate everything that you've done to make this one a success.